The Frumentarii. You are a provincial governor in the Roman Empire. A man comes to your door carrying official imperial documentation. He needs to inspect your grain storage. He is polite. He is professional. He counts the supply, writes something down, thanks you, and leaves. 3 weeks later, in a city you have never visited, an emperor you have never met reads a detailed report about a private conversation you had in your own home that you believed was completely unheard by anyone outside that room. You never saw the second set of notes. You never knew there was a second set of notes. That man was a frumentarius. The Frumentarii began as the most boring administrative function in the entire Roman Empire, a logistics corps whose sole documented purpose was to travel across every province counting grain supplies, processing taxation records, verifying military food requisitions, and because that function required them to carry official imperial documentation that opened every single door without question, to enter every military installation and every private estate and every governor's residence with completely legitimate recorded purpose, to question everyone and go everywhere and be received by nobody as anything other than a bureaucrat doing his paperwork. Some emperor at some point, and no surviving document names exactly who or exactly when, quietly redirected that entire infrastructure towards something else entirely. And by the reign of Hadrian, they were intercepting private correspondence, monitoring the political loyalty of military commanders, running embedded informant networks inside Christian communities across multiple provinces, and documenting meeting locations and clergy identities with a thoroughness so complete that Tertullian, writing around 197 AD, could only describe their reach by comparing it to divine omniscience. And he was not being poetic. He was warning his congregation about something they already understood from daily lived experience, which was that the man who asked about your grain storage might also be noting who visited your home after dark and what language they used when they thought nobody was listening. And when Diocletian finally dissolved them around 300 AD, he did not investigate them or reform them or hold a single person accountable. He erased the entire institution completely and immediately rebuilt the identical function under a different name with a different command structure. And what that decision tells you is not that an emperor preferred administrative tidiness, but that an institution had accumulated so much parallel power that starting completely over from nothing was less frightening than attempting to control what already existed. And the question historians have never fully resolved is whether any institution of that particular type ever truly starts over, or whether it simply changes its name and waits for the same internal logic to slowly reassert itself. Now the Sicarii. You are attending a religious festival in first-century Jerusalem. 10,000 people pressing shoulder to shoulder in the temple courtyard. The man beside you nods and smiles. Then you feel something wrong in your side. Not pain yet, just pressure. And by the time you understand what has happened, he is already 5 rows deep into the crowd and completely gone. The Sicarii are documented primarily by the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus in the Jewish War written around 75 AD, and their name comes from the Latin sica, a short, curved dagger, and the curve was not incidental to the design but central to it, allowing a concealed draw from beneath a cloak in a single fluid motion, engineered not for battlefield combat but for one specific technique, a kill achieved silently inside a crowd so dense that witnesses would not register what had happened until the body was already falling and the killer already absorbed back into the press of bodies and gone. And what matters about this is not the elegance of the method, but what it reveals about the minds behind it. Because you do not engineer a blade for that specific purpose unless you have already worked backward from a complete operational theory. Unless you have already asked yourself how a few hundred men with no army and no territory and no institutional power whatsoever can make an occupying force of thousands feel genuinely, personally, constantly unsafe. And the answer they arrived at was not to kill more people, but to make every single person in the city uncertain about every single person standing next to them, to dissolve the psychological foundation that makes normal daily life possible. And beyond the killings, they developed what may be the first hostage negotiation doctrine in the ancient world. kidnapping Roman officials and using them as leverage to free imprisoned members. And during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, they burned their own city's food supplies, accepting mass civilian starvation as a deliberate, calculated operational trade-off to deny resources to Roman forces, a strategic logic that appears in no earlier military doctrine anywhere in the ancient world. And Rome, with its vast administrative apparatus and its professional intelligence infrastructure, never successfully prosecuted a single sicarii leader while they were active, which is not an administrative failure. That is, a security achievement of the highest possible order. And the text that would explain how they maintained that operational security across 20 years of military occupation does not exist. It has never been found. And for a movement sophisticated enough to invent the doctrine they demonstrably used, the absence of any surviving written record is itself a question that nobody has fully answered. Now the Hashasheen. You are Saladin. You are the greatest military commander of the medieval world. You have just retaken Jerusalem. You command an empire stretching from Egypt to Iraq. You are sleeping in a fortified camp surrounded by bodyguards inside a perimeter that no enemy force has breached. And you wake up, and there is a poisoned cake beside your head, and a note pinned to your tent wall with a dagger. The note does not threaten, it informs. It says essentially, "We were here. We could have." And you send a messenger to the mountains of Syria that same morning, because you understand immediately and completely what the message means. The Hashasheen are documented in Arabic chronicles, Crusader records, and Bernard Lewis spent an entire career in the primary sources and published his definitive account in 1967. And the story most people know about them, the Paradise Garden, the hashish, the recruits drugged into visions of heaven and promised a return ticket if they died for the cause, that story appears in none of the contemporaneous Islamic sources. It appears in Marco Polo writing 2 centuries after the fact. It appears in the accounts of enemies and rivals. And what a sophisticated intelligence operation would most want its enemies to believe is precisely that its agents are drug-conditioned fanatics rather than genuine ideological professionals. Because a fanatic can theoretically be countered, but a man who has made a considered, rational, irreversible personal decision to die for something is a completely different operational problem. And Hassan-i-Sabah seized the fortress of Alamut in 1090, without a siege because his people were already inside the garrison before he arrived, having spent months converting the defenders from within, and he held that fortress for 35 years without ever once leaving it, running a distributed network of approximately 100 fortresses connected by no contiguous territory whatsoever, held together not by geography but by a psychological architecture so precisely constructed that the Vizier Nizam al-Mulk, the most powerful administrative official in the entire Seljuk Empire, was killed in 1092 by an agent who had spent months inside his court, posing as a Sufi mystic. The killing performed in daylight, in public. The killer gone before the crowd understood what had happened. Now, Rashid al-Din Sinan. He arrived in Syria from Alamut around 1162 as a subordinate commander, and within a decade had made himself effectively independent, answering to no authority, Islamic or Crusader, running his operation from a single mountain fortress in a way that made the most powerful military commander of the medieval world negotiate rather than retaliate. And the Saladin tent incident is documented in multiple independent Arabic sources and considered historically reliable by mainstream scholarship. And beyond Saladin, Crusader knights on both sides of the conflict were simultaneously paying tribute to Sinan's fortresses in exchange for operational immunity, meaning both sides of a holy war were paying protection money to the same mountain. And when Crusader ambassadors came to negotiate, Sinan received them and gave a quiet gesture, whereupon 2 of his men standing on the castle walls stepped off into empty air and fell to their deaths without hesitation. Not in battle, not under the pressure of combat, but in cold, deliberate demonstration in front of foreign witnesses. And those ambassadors went home and reported exactly what they had seen. And that single act of theater did more strategic work than any number of killings, because what it communicated was not that these men could be ordered to die, but that they had already individually decided to, long before anyone named a target, long before anyone gave a signal. And Sinan's Syrian archives at Masyaf were captured by the Mongols in 1260 and have never been recovered. Now the Vema. You are a nobleman in 15th century Germany. One morning, your steward brings news that empties the blood from your face. A man 2 villages over was found hanging from an oak tree at dawn with a knife, a rope, and a handful of straw pinned to his chest. You know what that means. You know what it means that you don't know who did it, and you already understand that you may have been charged by the same court, tried, convicted, and sentenced without ever once being told that your trial was happening. The Vema operated under claimed imperial authority across the Holy Roman Empire. Its members divided into those who knew the passwords and signs and those who did not. And a person could be summoned 3 times without knowing they were being summoned, convicted in complete absence without knowing they had been charged. And the sentence, once issued, was distributed as a personal obligation of execution to every sworn member across the entire empire, which meant that from the moment of conviction, every neighbor, every servant, every business partner, every man you shared a meal with for the rest of your natural life might already be carrying an obligation to kill you, and you would never know which ones. And Emperor Sigismund was himself a sworn member, documented in contemporary chronicles, giving the organization a direct line into imperial politics. And Duke Charles the Bold was summoned, refused to appear, was convicted in absentia, died in battle in 1477. And contemporary chronicles record that rumors immediately circulated that the distributed execution obligation had been fulfilled through battlefield arrangement rather than direct assassination. And documented Vema-associated killings continued appearing in German police records as late as the 1820s, more than 3 centuries after the organization's formal decline. Now the Carbonari. They did not try to destroy the governments they opposed. They tried to become them. Lawyers and journalists and military officers and government ministers and aristocrats who had taken an oath over a ritual borrowed from charcoal burning, spreading across Italy and France and Spain and Portugal and into South America in the early 19th century, through a cell structure so compartmentalized that any individual member knew only the people immediately around them, and nothing of the organization's full geography. And the revolutionary movements that swept through Europe in 1820 and 1821 and 1830 and 1848 had Carbonari fingerprints documented in the internal security reports of contemporary governments who publicly attributed the upheavals to spontaneous popular feeling, because attributing them to a coordinated organization with members already inside their own administrations was a more frightening thing to formally acknowledge. Now, the Tongs. They did not begin as criminal organizations. They began as the only functional legal system available to people who had no access to any other. Chinese immigrants in 19th century America who could not testify in court, could not own property, could not become citizens, and were subject to violence that the legal system had no structural interest in addressing. And what always emerges from that specific combination of complete legal vulnerability and complete community isolation is an internal governance structure with its own courts and its own enforcement and its own taxation and its own protection mechanisms. And the Tongs developed a cell structure, a recognition system of specific hand signs and phrase responses, an internal judicial process, and an enforcement arm. And they operated across every Chinatown in every major American city simultaneously, with a coordination that federal investigators spent decades trying to map and never fully succeeded in mapping, because the structure was specifically designed to be unmappable from outside, by people whose authority the organization had learned through direct experience to treat not as protection, but as threat. Now the Leopard Society. A body is found in a village in Sierra Leone. The wounds are clearly from an animal, the claw marks precise, the pattern entirely consistent with leopard attack. Except there are no leopard tracks anywhere near the body, and the internal organs have been removed in a way that no wild leopard removes organs. British colonial investigators who eventually found the technology behind it found iron claw gloves with multi-pronged blades specifically engineered to produce leopard wound patterns on human tissue, recovered at multiple independent locations across Sierra Leone and Nigeria, with a consistent design that meant the same underlying logic had informed their construction across 1,000 kilometers and multiple generations. And the 1903 Sierra Leone trials produced 87 convictions, and the 1945 Nigeria trials produced 73 executions. And what both sets of investigators working 40 years and 1,000 kilometers apart documented independently was the same recognition system, the same body scarification patterns, the same call and response phrases, the same ritual object described in identical terms by witnesses who had no contact with each other. And Rosalind Shaw's fieldwork in the 1990s found the tradition preserved in oral memory across communities that had been completely separated during the colonial suppression period, which means the organization survived not through any central structure, but through something more durable than central structure. And no recovered ritual object has ever been subject to full scientific analysis. And the question of where the cross-ethnic operational standardization actually came from, which community, at what point in history, for what original purpose, has never been answered. Now, the Black Hand. On a warm Sunday morning in June 1914, an 18-year-old named Gavrilo Princip was standing on a Sarajevo street corner after a failed assassination attempt earlier that same day. The plan was over. The team had scattered. The target had survived. Then a car took a wrong turn and stalled directly in front of him, and he fired twice. And by the time the smoke cleared, the First World War had begun. And what history consistently underemphasizes is that Princip did not arrive at that corner with a plan of his own. He was a recruit of an organization so secret that the Serbian government officially denied its existence, while its own military intelligence chief was running it, and the Black Hand was founded on the 9th of May 1911 by 11 Serbian army officers whose founding oath was taken over a skull and crossed bones and a dagger and a revolver. And its leader, Dragutin Dmitrijević, known as Apis, simultaneously served as chief of Serbian military intelligence, meaning the organization that officially did not exist was being run by the man officially responsible for the state's secrets. And the assassination team was recruited, trained, and equipped by Black Hand operatives and transported across the border through a network of border guards who were Black Hand members. And Apis was tried and executed by the Serbian government in 1917 before any neutral party could question him. And the most important witness to the full operational structure of the organization that started the First World War was silenced by the government whose military intelligence chief had been running it. And Serbian state archives reportedly contain sealed portions of his final confession. And now the Stasi, and what the Stasi understood that every previous organization on this list had understood in its own way and in its own century, was that you do not need to arrest everyone to control everyone. You only need everyone to believe that arrest is possible at any moment for any reason. And at its peak, the Stasi had one informant for every 63 citizens of East Germany, the highest ratio of surveillance to population in recorded human history. Not professional agents, but neighbors and colleagues and friends and spouses, and in documented cases, children who filed regular reports on the people closest to them. And the specific achievement of this was not the information it gathered, but the condition it created. A society in which trust itself became functionally impossible, in which every relationship carried the permanent, ambient possibility of betrayal. And when the wall fell in 1989 and citizens broke into Stasi headquarters, they found 111 kilometers of shelved files and approximately 15,000 bags of shredded documents that archivists have spent decades trying to reconstruct piece by piece. And what connects all 10 of these organizations across 4,000 years and 6 continents is not their methods or their geographies or their specific belief systems, but one single discovery that each of them made independently and then built entire institutional architectures around, which is that the most powerful weapon in the world is not a blade or a poison or an army or even information. It is a specific condition installed in your enemy's psychology, the condition of not knowing. Not knowing who among the people immediately around them already belongs to something else. Not knowing whether the sentence has already been issued. Not knowing whether the man counting your grain is writing a different kind of report afterward. And every empire and kingdom and colonial government on this list was not destroyed by these organizations. It was paralyzed by them. Paralyzed not by what they had done, but by the permanent, unresolvable uncertainty of what they might do next and through whom. And that is the pattern that conventional historical explanation keeps trying to attribute to coincidence and context and specific local conditions. And those explanations account for a great deal, but they do not account for why in every single case on this list, the most important witnesses were silenced, the most important documents disappeared, and the most consequential questions were left unanswered by archives that are either sealed or destroyed or conveniently missing. And what you have just spent the last several minutes inside is not a collection of historical footnotes. It is a pattern. And the one tool that none of these organizations across 4,000 years of trying ever fully managed to suppress was exactly this: the capacity to look at what happened and ask not what, but how. And not how, but why. And not why, but who. And not who, but who else.